This is just to begin with a little bit of history, and not much, I hope. This is the Russian Empire under the Tsars on the eve of World War I. And if you draw a line from Finland, roughly St. Petersburg, down to Rostov-on-Don, roughly the eastern border of Ukraine, in time, today's map of Europe. In the meantime, what you have are a series of new countries, newly recognized states that have taken the place of that part of the Tsarist Empire that you saw on the earlier slide. So a natural question is, where are we now, since we can't talk about way in the last 23 years, in the sense that 23 years ago, everyone, and I plead guilty, everyone really believed that we could do worse than Putin. Some people were pretty enthusiastic about him, but even the most skeptical thought Putin's about the best that we're going to get. And why did we think that? Because he was blessed by President Yeltsin, who really arranged his incumbency by resigning as president on New Year's Eve of 1999, allowing Putin as prime minister under the Constitution. And by gosh, Putin believes in the law, if nothing else. This allowed Putin being president before presidential elections 3 months later, in which Putin won. That sounded a lot like me, but I turned mine off. More than that, Putin had served a notable Democrat, Anatoly Sobchak, in St. Petersburg for 6 years. He'd then been brought to Moscow as Yeltsin's deputy chief of staff, having been recommended by the architect of Yeltsin's own privatization plan, which turned out to be a major disaster, discrediting the Democrats. Small d, of course. And on the other hand, of course, we knew that he was a KGB officer professionally for most of his life. However, what a lot of people don't realize is that in the Soviet era, to be a KGB officer meant that you did not have ideological Marxist-Leninist blinders on. You knew the real situation. And so there were many in the KGB who were, quote, liberals, in the sense that they realized that what the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was putting on was pokazuka, stuff for show all the time, for ideological reasons. So that didn't seem to be a big mark against Putin either. He did leave the KGB as the Communist Party was collapsing, and that counted also in his favor, although, of course, it was a late departure from the secret police. This was an era also, 1980, when Yuri Andropov, former KGB chief, became general secretary of the Communist Party, the top guy in the Soviet Union. And it was noted approvingly and hopefully in the New York Times and elsewhere that, well, you know, the KGB and Andropov himself is known to really prefer scotch to vodka. We have to move these in the opposite direction, I'm learning. So we had a period of bipartisan miscalculation and trouble doing this. We will shift to arrows and see if that matters. There we go. Now I'm getting it. So the bipartisan miscalculation. This is a point that's been made over the years, I suppose, but we sometimes forget it. President Clinton, when he met Putin, said, quote, publicly after the meeting, Putin is capable of creating a strong and prosperous Russia. This was as Clinton is leaving office. That was a very well crafted statement, as we came to appreciate from Bill Clinton. He knew exactly what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. No mention of democracy, no mention of civil society, strong and prosperous. Well, sure. President Bush said he looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. His language, of course, was extremely unfortunate, but my guess is that Bush probably had been told by some of his Russia advisors, the Russians have soul, and it's very safe for you to say something about their soul, and everyone will approve, and it won't be politically controversial. And here is not what I imagined it to be. Here's the lobster summit that took place at Walker Point in Kennebunkport in 2008. It was just 5 weeks later that Putin invaded Georgia as Bush is leaving office. Now, President Trump set a new standard in terms of, and you don't know whether it's miscalculation or whatever, but he managed to praise Trump as late as February of 2022, after Putin had annexed, quote, Donetsk and Luhansk, which he did not control. He controlled only a part of it, as he does today. But he said that this was genius and very savvy. Well, if you're not Trump, if you're a old school geopolitician, you might say, okay, fair enough, it was savvy of him. And yet no American president should ever say that. He doubled down, saying Putin was pretty smart. Why? Because he'd taken over a country for $2 worth of sanctions. Well, you can see again how, if you're a skeptic of the usefulness of economic sanctions, you could say, well, Trump sort of has a point there. But again, no American president should say that. Just last January, Trump said he trusted Putin more than what he called then the lowlifes who work in U.S. intelligence. Of course, all of this from Trump is really a reflection of the fact that he believes that there was a conspiracy within the FBI and the CIA to deprive him of votes in the 2016-2020 elections. After meeting with Putin in Helsinki, he said he didn't see any reason why Russia should have meddled in the 2016 election. That, of course, was a staggering statement, since there was every reason to see why Putin might have done so. But of course, President Trump did, as his supporters still maintain, has a sense that because there was a rogue FBI agent and maybe a not very good CIA FBI process for clearing accusations against him, that there was a broad institutional conspiracy against him. Lenin once referred to liberals who wanted to be a part of, the great communist experiment that the Bolsheviks were running in 1917 and thereafter. Lenin used to refer to the people as useful idiots. So moving right along, for better or worse, almost certainly for better, we have, I'm going to set out, I guess, 4 alternative futures. The way in which developments may take place in the next few years. Alternative future number one, and take notes because I'll be asking you at the end which of the four you vote for. Alternative future number one is that Putin wins his Ukraine war and he stays in power. He's able to consolidate his support against his enemies. The Ukraine is unable to oust the Russian army, which is really dug into positions that probably all of you have read about or seen photos of to some extent. The Ukrainian army in this outcome is forced to retreat from the front lines in all the four occupied regions of Ukraine. He has some political success because having lost the war, as it were, the Ukraine and the West recognize the Russian annexation of all these four regions. And NATO, under Ukraine under NATO pressure, really, which reads American pressure, and Russia signed the accord recognizing the independence and territorial integrity of rump Ukraine. That is to say, the basic deal in this alternative future is that Putin gets to keep Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and the Kherson area. And in return, Putin commits in writing to respect the territorial integrity of the remaining part of Ukraine. This is familiar, of course, to those of us who lived through Adolf Hitler's assurances that he didn't want anything more than the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. President Trump, in this alternative future scenario, calls this a perfect agreement. Maybe he even is behind it and takes credit for ending the war in any event. NATO at this point is in disarray because victory has many fathers and defeat is an orphan. And Poland, Romania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic declare the accord a useless piece of paper. That's because they're on the front line of where Russian troops now are in this scenario. Putin, who declaims against Lenin all the time for reasons we won't get into, nevertheless seems to embody Lenin's dictum. And Lenin said, you know, when it comes to politics, think of it as war. And if your bayonet strikes mush, push on. If it strikes steel, step back. And this is, I think, Putin's basic approach to politics, domestic and foreign. In this alternative future, the Black Sea naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea, is strengthened and new ships are added to the fleet by Putin. He uses this fleet to blockade Odessa and other ports that still are in Ukrainian hands. Meanwhile, he takes advantage of the ethnic minorities in that old Tsarist empire who are not a part of the new Russian Federation. And these ethnic minorities are used as a fifth column, to use again the terminology from the 1930s. They, in the case of Moldova, are 30% of the population. They seek reincorporation into something Putin calls the Russian world, which basically means Russian-speaking people wherever they are. And he foments attacks from Moldova into southwest Ukraine and says, these aren't Russian troops. These are Moldovans who are trying to simply resist Ukrainian domination. Ethnic minorities in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also agitate for the restoration of Moscow's authority. There wouldn't be Russians in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania if it weren't for the fact that Stalin took over those states in 1940 as a part of the Hitler-Stalin Pact and deported hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of those Baltic peoples to the Gulag and replaced them by bringing in ethnic Russians, whose descendants are now in those countries and sometimes feeling, at least in the past, as if they've been second-class citizens. Viktor Orban, who's Hungary's president and has been most pro-Putin of all the East European leaders, knows which way the wind is blowing and withdraws from NATO in this scenario. President Xi of China, meanwhile, demands the withdrawal of the U.S. defense commitment to Taiwan, 50 years after Nixon conceded that China had sovereignty over the island. Things have been relatively stable since then, but having seen how failed the U.S. effort has been to resist Russian imperialism, she learns the appropriate lesson. Meanwhile, South Korea and Japan, always nervous about China, ask Washington whether or not the U.S. nuclear umbrella really can still be relied upon. So this is one broad alternative future that could happen if Putin wins the war, in my imagination. Here I just have something that'll give you the idea of how Putin might be able to win the war. These are the defenses that Russia has spent the last year erecting in the ground, all the way from the border in the north of Ukraine down to Crimea. And it's a threefold system, sometimes repeated again, sixfold, in which you first face trenches, and then the Ukrainian army trying to re-seize Ukrainian territory from the occupiers, then encounters dragon's teeth, and those are anti-tank obstacles. And then there are anti-tank ditches. And so this is a formidable defense array. And these pyramids are 4 feet high concrete pyramids that tanks can't easily get over. And what they do is they lift up in front, the bows up, which makes the inside innards of the tank particularly vulnerable to the Russian soldiers who are available further down the line. And finally, I guess, if in this scenario Putin is victorious, I think you'll see other cities looking like Grozny did in 1999 after Putin, as prime minister, attacked what he called terrorists, who were a mix of separatists and Islamist terrorists. The Russian approach to war is not surgical. Meanwhile, Putin is unlikely, I think, to be killed. Certainly not in this scenario. He has special chefs cooking his food. He has a biological safety center to make sure that the food he eats is okay. I don't know if he has a taster. We get this, by the way, from someone who was in the Russian Secret Service, whose job it was, he was an engineer, whose job it was to ensure the communications lines were secure wherever Putin went. And he defected just a few months ago and brought with him inside knowledge. All of his residences have bomb shelters. He's very careful to mask his travel by creating false motorcades and air activity. He has access to about 20 yachts. He doesn't own most of them himself, but except that, Putin owns kind of all of them, because any oligarch who hasn't cooperated with him in the last 20 years has either been poisoned, jailed, or driven into exile. He does not use mobile phones or the internet. Smart guy. The result, however, for a political leader is that he lives in an information vacuum. And according to Gleb Karakulov, he is getting very little information from anyone other than his intelligence people, in whom, of course, he has tremendous trust. all the officials and the guards and so on who were going to be in contact with him had to have to go through 2 weeks of quarantine. Whether that's still true, I don't know. His mistresses, of whom he has one currently, at least, Alina Kabayeva, and I think I may have shared her photo with you a year ago, fetching Russian damsel, and Svetlana Krivinogi are similarly protected by the Federal Guard Service, the Secret Service. We've skipped ahead here. There we go. Alternative number 2. In this future, Putin loses the war, and he loses power in a coup d'etat. It's a little hard to imagine after 20 years of Putin in power that such a thing could happen. But almost no one, except Andrei Amalrik, predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991. In this alternative future, the Ukrainian army is successful, and they expel the Russian army from the Donbass and the Crimea using their drones, Turkish drones, their own drones, and they have hundreds of drone factories around Ukraine. And it's been said that Home Depot is their biggest military supplier. And this is because also the United States has given the Army's tactical air missile force missiles to Ukraine, a decision that is up in the air, and we may hear something about in the next few days. And the NATO fighter bombers like the F-16, which also the Ukraine has been seeking for the last year, and which I think, not to his credit, President Biden has been rather slow to come around to provide. But he has his reasons. He, of course, doesn't want the Russians to directly hold the United States responsible for their problems. Russian morale disintegrates, particularly in the army, and has happened a year ago in the battlefield. Young and untrained draftees are there, and are there the cannon fodder, and they're fleeing the battlefield. They're doing some of that now, but not as much. So popular support for Putin dissolves. He's probably mobilized the country for war and instituted conscription on a very wide scale. The Crimean headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet is put directly at risk, and senior officers had that feeling that Sergei Akhramyev had when, as chief of staff of the army in 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, he took his own life, and he left a suicide note saying, "The whole meaning of my life is destroyed. I can no longer live." But these senior officers don't act on the second half of Akhramyev's note. Instead, the military leaders enlist KGB and now called foreign, the FSB instead of the KGB, in a plot. Everyone calls it the KGB still because no one's being fooled by the change of initials. They start a plot that overthrows Putin in this second scenario. The defense minister and the chief of the general staff both resent the fact that they've been held responsible for military failures in a war that was a political war that was really Putin's own war and not theirs. The word is that Gerasimov and Shoigu actually resisted also Putin's plan, successfully implemented, to take over the Crimea. And of course, there's nothing that feeds the ego of a Putin or a Hitler than being told by your generals that, oh, you can't do that, it's too dangerous. And then you say, go ahead and do it anyway. And it turns out you're vindicated. So the Russian army withdraws, at least from the Donbass, maybe not Crimea, which is, after all, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. But the slogan is peace without Putin or Putinism without Putin. But in any case, Ukraine is offered peace and the Donbass in return for Moscow's being able to keep Crimea. I raise this only because it suggests a future diplomatic dilemma that Ukraine and the United States and NATO may face. And that is, are you prepared to get back some of the country by giving up another part of it? But obviously the Kremlin in these conditions abandons Putin's concept of the Russian world and the restoration of the Russian Empire, quite the opposite. NATO maintains its military readiness, but as a part of this deal, we can imagine that they lift economic sanctions, because this is something that even while Putin says they haven't had any effect, they certainly have had an effect. They've just been not substantial enough in effect to cause Putin to reverse course in his invasion. Meanwhile, because other powers are always watching Washington to see, to judge, to calculate what they can get away with, China absence of any timeline for Taiwan becoming a part of China. Nixon and Mao agreed that yes, Taiwan is integral to China, but no one ever said when it had to happen. In this scenario, in which Putin has lost, and indeed maybe lost his life in a coup, you can see part of the reason why the military and the security forces might be alarmed at Putin's failure. Because here you see Russia's new border with NATO. Putin claimed that one of the principal reasons he had to invade Ukraine was that NATO was expanding. Well, the net result of his invasion of the Ukraine is that he's got himself 2 new NATO members in Finland and Sweden. The Turks have now agreed to let them in. He's got an 800-mile border with NATO that he didn't have before, Finland having been, like Sweden, historically neutral. The Russian internal security agencies are summarized here, and I won't go into detail except to make a couple of points. One is that the old minister of the Interior used to be a very important guy, so important, in fact, as head of the forces, he would be able really to be a major player in determining who the leader of the Soviet Union would be. In this case, though, Westerners think that Kolokholtsev is a relatively independent professional rather than a Putin tool. One sign of that to them is that Putin pulled the National Guard out from under the Ministry of the Interior and created the Rosgvardia National Guard, led by a Viktor Zolotov, who is a Putin tool. And under Zolotov, you have the Oman, they're called Special Purpose Mobile Units, think riot police, hundreds of thousands of them around the country. You have also I love this language, Special Rapid Response Detachments, think SWAT teams. That's to go after, on the one hand, terrorists, but on the other hand, also anyone who might be conspiring against you. And the Rosgvardia has the interior troops now that used to be under the Minister of the Interior. These are very substantial troops in the hundreds of thousands, and they are, I think it's described as lightly mechanized. So these are troops that would be absolutely essential to forestall a coup or to create a coup. And then you have the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov's forces that are informally apparently being coordinated by Zolotov to try and keep them in line more than Prigozhin was kept in line. The Federal Security Service, that's the FSB, think KGB, a loyalist there of Putin's. And then the Federal Protective Service, I mentioned it and the Presidential Security Service because that is where that defector came from. The last two individuals and committees are relevant really only if there's a long-term tug of war in which one faction is trying to discredit the other by accusing them successfully of corruption. Alternative number three, in this future, there's a popular revolt. It could be another Putin, only Putinism without Putin, or it could be a Democrat, small d. But in this scenario, the NATO has delivered 100 or so F-16s and the Attack-M missiles and trained the Ukrainian airmen to fly them in squadrons and be effective against Russian forces. Putin is forced to draft maybe 500,000 new recruits, put Russia on a full war footing, stoking widespread uncertainty and fear. We saw some of that, not much, but some a year ago when Putin conducted a forced conscription. Ukraine succeeds in bleeding the Russian army, forces out of the Donbass, and isolates it in Crimea. You can see that this bears some similarity to the alternative future number two. The Russian military, however, collapses, and it leads to it collapses partly because of demoralization. And so the senior officers cannot get compliance from subordinates in order to overthrow Putin, or for that matter, to keep Putin in power. In this case, though, like Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, both came from within the Communist Party, a new leader does emerge from Putin's entourage. Very hard to know whom. Putin is arrested in this scenario, is sent to The Hague for trial as a war criminal before the International Court of Justice. Opponents of the war and political prisoners are released, including Alexei Navalny, who is Putin's biggest critic. And the new leader, whoever he is, announces his interim government will withdraw from the Donbass, but not Crimea. Crimea is always a little bit of an exception, and hold free elections. Possibly in this scenario, Navalny, who was poisoned with Novichok 3 years ago and is now serving, you add it all up, 28 years in the Gulag. He may announce his candidacy for president of Russia if he's freed. He had won 27% of the vote in Moscow's mayoralty election about a decade ago. Maybe he surrenders Crimea, maybe he doesn't. But maybe he agrees to war and reconstruction reparations to the Ukraine. And lo and behold, Russia rejoins NATO's Partnership for Peace that Yeltsin had joined as kind of a way station toward perhaps eventual membership in NATO. Winston Churchill is famous for, of course, having said that Russia was a riddle. I never get these in the right order. A riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Less well known is that he said Kremlin intrigues are comparable to a bulldog fight under a rug. An outsider only hears the growling. He had a way with words, didn't he? Well, a majority, actually, of Kremlin officials come from the KGB and military intelligence, the GRU. They are siloviki, very common Russian word now, men of force, the people who control the power ministries. What makes it plausible that there might be a revolution in Russia? Because in the period since the beginning of the 20th century, we've had 4 instances in which Russian revolutions have led to dramatic change. I won't go into detail, but in 1905, there was a sometimes called dress rehearsal for 1917, a failed revolution that nevertheless caused the Tsar to enact constitutional reforms, creating a Duma or a parliament, and limited his power, at least on paper. Over the course of the next 10 years, he withdrew most of the concessions he made. But nevertheless, it led to significant political change. In February of 1917, of course, the Tsar is overthrown. In October of 1917, the Democratic Provisional Government is overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky. Then in 1991, we had a coup attempt by Siloviki, men of power, to try and remove Gorbachev from power. The result of which was ultimately that Gorbachev did lose power, but to Yeltsin, not to the men of power. And military failure in Afghanistan also suggests how military failure can be devastating to the country. It was Afghanistan that drained the Russian economy and that compelled the Politburo to elect Gorbachev as general secretary of the party, and then Gorbachev to enact a series of reforms, including glasnost or openness, in order to try and weather the economic storm that Afghanistan had contributed to. So who might emerge? I have not asked for questions, but I'd be absolutely happy to entertain any that you might have. I've been talking now for 40 minutes or more. Yes, Peter.
How, at one point, Putin seemed to threaten to use nuclear bombs, if the United States got too involved. I mean, is that a credible threat? Would Putin really do that?
No, is the short answer. It was a bluff, as we've seen. He'd never put nuclear weapons into operational mode. It was bluster and was seen as such because we could tell that he had not operationalized anything different. Would he use nuclear weapons if it was an existential question, another word he has used? I doubt it. But that's one of those imponderables that is part of the fourth and last alternative future. Yeah. Would Medvedev emerge as a post-Putin leader? Well, this would be Putinism without Putin, perhaps, or a liberal Putin again. I love this photo because you can just see Putin saying, "Dmitry, make sure your watch is on the same time as mine." Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, with whom probably everyone is familiar to some extent, might have been a post-Putin leader, but no longer. He's dead, having been probably bombed out of his aircraft, along with his number 2, Dmitry Utkin, and his number 3, chief of security. So now who would have been responsible for such a dastardly deed? One can only guess. But it was a really great hit from Putin's perspective. Interestingly enough, a few weeks after Prigozhin's march on Moscow that ended so inexplicably in nothing, the head of MI6, Richard Moore, they never are identified. They never speak in public. But he spoke publicly and he said that the march on Moscow by Prigozhin had humiliated Putin. Oh, this is the famous sledgehammer associated with Prigozhin. You're aware that when the Wagnerites came across some Russian soldier, or maybe even a fellow Wagnerite, who had not followed orders and charged into the machine guns, that they would be taken, in some instances at least, and their head put on a chopping block and a sledgehammer used to pulverize them, their heads. That saying, you can see it inscribed in Cyrillic on the sledgehammer, says for use in important negotiations. We could do worse than Putin, maybe. Jerry.
How concerned are you with the Ukrainian army stands now that the defense minister resigned, 6 subordinates have been replaced, and the report is that morale is not good on the front because they've gone from a defensive war to an offensive war. How concerned are you with the Ukrainian military at this point?
Well, I'm no military expert, and so I don't really know how to respond. I do know that there are 2 ways of spinning the firing of the defense minister and 6 deputy defense ministers. One is the optimistic, well, the one you just presented, which is its disarray at the top of the Ministry of Defense. The other spin is, isn't it marvelous what Zelensky is doing? Because everyone knows that military procurement has been a disastrous source of corruption. And he's getting rid of all these corrupt officials who benefited most from it. On the front, the latest in the last few days, or a couple of days maybe even, is that the Ukrainians have begun to make progress, both around Bakhmut and in the south toward Melitopol, to cut off Russian supply and that channel of communication that the Crimean forces of the Russian army depend on. But progress has been slow and disappointing. It hasn't been helped by the administration and NATO's reluctance a year ago to send in weaponry that could have made a difference. And now they're saying, well, you know, they've been dragging their feet for a year. And they, as recently as a month ago, the explanation was, well, you know, it takes a year to train Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16s. It takes a year to train them to use the ATACMS and so on. Well, if that decision had been made a year ago, today the Ukrainians would have those forces that would put the Russians more on the defensive. But I can't really answer that. I just follow, if you're interested in following that, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, has daily, nightly readouts of the very latest military activities all across the Ukraine. They rely on Maxar satellite technology. They probably get a lot of information from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which, however, they judiciously use rather than just saluting to what is probably a good news Xerox machine.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I read an article about the fact that the young people in Russia behind the curtain, or that's not there, but because they can get all the news that they want, they know how to circumvent all the things that Russia puts in gear, so they can't get any longer. phones and computers, and they don't support him, but the people of my generation do, because they don't know how to work all the machines.
There's probably something to that. There's a big divide, I think, between Moscow and St. Petersburg on the one hand, where you have a urban population, highly educated, lots of students, lots of high-tech people, and the broad Russian countryside full of peasants whose grandparents had been serfs, or maybe whose parents were killed in the great Soviet Holocaust of the 1930s.
But the argument was that Russia has always been ruled with a fist. And that, I mean, from the days of the SARS.
Yeah,
And that the people.
and so he allowed people to write stuff that was very critical of his administration, his regime. He has compressed more and more the living space of the media, if you will. And so, yes, now it's a question really of trying to get some of those blogs. And then you're dealing with really a small part of the population, but it's a critical part. It's an educated part. And there's the danger for Putin. Yeah. Yes. Ma'am.
We have a question from Zoom. Sam Hunterman. How on earth could someone close to Putin manage to escape?
Yeah.
He escaped Karakulov, not that man, but Karakulov from the Guards Division. He escaped on one of the trips that he had to take in order to prepare a site for a Putin visit. And so he arranged with his wife, very circuitously, without all the details being released, of course, to get out as a part of that travel that he had to do. Yeah. Thanks, Paulie. Sam? Other questions? Here is Boris Nemtsov, who could certainly have been Putin's most successful opponent in electoral terms. He was assassinated, however, 8 years ago, just 2 days before he was going to address a rally to oppose Putin's invasion of the Crimea and the Donbass. That happened in 2014. We think of the invasion of Ukraine sometimes as happened on February 24th, 2022. But Putin sent weapons and soldiers, denying it, into the Donbass in 2014. And he sent little green men, probably Wagnerites, into the Crimea and took it too at that time. And so here is his main anti-war opponent assassinated just within sight of, in the shadow of the Kremlin almost. Here is Alexei Navalny, who is alive. That's a plus. If you're looking now at the democratic alternatives to Putinism without Putin, he's been attacking the regime for corruption for more than a decade. They convicted him of, quote, embezzlement a couple of years after he started this. Nevertheless, he ran for mayor of Moscow and won an amazing percentage of the vote against a Putin candidate. He was barred, however, as a convicted felon, embezzlement, from running for president in 2018 by the Central Election Commission. Everyone is, you know. The latest interpretation of Hitler, you know, is that while Hitler did not sign every lamentable position and policy that the Third Reich instituted, everyone was, quote, working for Hitler, working toward Hitler. And having been a political appointee in the Reagan administration, I understand. You're, as a political supporter of the top guy, you were sort of sitting there thinking, well, now, what is it that he wants? And when you're presented with this alternative or that alternative, you try, not to be disloyal, and you try to further the administration's agenda. Well, this is working for Hitler in a Nazi context, and I like to think that there are an awful lot of people in Russia who are working towards Putin without him having to sign stuff that could then land him into hot water. Navalny was poisoned with Novichok 3 years ago. He was evacuated to Germany, where German doctors saved his life. He decides he's going to return to Russia and continue the fight. Talk about courage.
Didn't he know what was going to happen?
He knew it was 50-50, but there's that 50% chance that he won't dare arrest me. And there's a 50% chance that if arrested, I can continue to be a symbol of ousting him from power. But yeah, I mean, most normal people would have headed for, the Greek islands. He was sentenced to 2.5 years back for embezzlement. Then they added on 9 years, and then they added on 19. Most recently for, quote, extremism. That's because he spoke out against the war. And so, it's an irrelevant arithmetical exercise. He'll be in jail or dead as long as Putin is in power. This last one is, and if I'm talking too long, give me a shout. We tend to think that the Navalnys and the Yeltsins are good and the Putins are bad, which I think is fair. But note that in September of 1999, Yeltsin, meeting with Clinton for their last meeting before Clinton leaves office, and Yeltsin, he's very emotional and he's blasting Clinton for his support for Chechen terrorists that Clinton and the US government regards as, some of them are, but some of them just want separation from Russia. But Chechnya is a part of the Russian Federation. It's not like Ukraine. It's a part of the Russian Federation. But then he says, just give Europe to Russia. Yeltsin says to Clinton, because Russia is in Europe and the United States is not. I mean, this is Putin. It's his calculation is that we're nearby. We're going to be here forever. We have been here forever. And the United States is all the way across Europe and all the way across the Atlantic. And we have staying power and the United States doesn't. And of course, the mangled evacuation from Afghanistan illustrated the accuracy of that point. And Yeltsin says you can take all the other states and provide security to them. I mean, he's a regular Trump, isn't he? I will take Europe and provide them with security. Amazing. Yes, ask a Pole, or Estonian, or Latvian, or Lithuanian, or Ukrainian, or etc. So this is the story, I think, of colonial empires collapsing. And this is just another one. And the cause is nationalism. There's just a feeling on the part of people that they are part of a nation. And it has been far stronger than any political or religious ideology of the last 200 years, since Napoleon first fanned French nationalism, and by invading the rest of Europe, fanning those individual nationalisms. And so the map of Europe, which we return to very briefly, shows you the new states just since World War I, since the end of World War I. I counted at least 20, and I don't think I got them all. And that all has been a reflection of nationalism. All those empires, multinational empires, colonial empires, they've all collapsed, except for the Russian one. Well, it collapsed too, didn't it? And that's what Putin wants to restore. In this sense, President Obama may have been right when he said that Putin was on the wrong side of history. He said it rather magisterially, didn't do much about it, but he may have been right. So in summary, almost, next to last slide this is, what we're seeing now, I think, is a turn to the Yalta dilemma. In 1945, the wartime leaders got together in Crimea, Yalta, wonderful beach there. They got together and they agreed that the East European countries would all have democratic elections. They also agreed that the governments of Eastern Europe would all be friendly to the Soviet Union. I mean, that was Stalin's understandable expectation. The only problem is you can't have both. There is sufficient nationalist feeling against Russian domination that you can't get many democratically elected governments that are going to be friendly to Russia. And that is, of course, a great problem for the future. And finally, alternative futures number 4, or to infinity. These are the most likely ones, perhaps. The ones that we haven't talked about, they could be called tail outcomes in that they are, I guess, on a bell curve at the 2 extreme ends where not much is ever happening. But when something happens on the curves, the tails, they can be such a surprise that they shake the world. And so, known unknowns, and I adopt here some of the language that Donald Rumsfeld made famous, but he did not invent. Nuclear weapons could be used by Putin, that would change an awful lot of calculations. He could be assassinated. Zelensky could be assassinated. How would Ukraine hold together? And there have been attempts on his life if he were assassinated. China could choose to arm Putin in return for Putin's support for an invasion of Taiwan or a blockade of Taiwan or military pressure on Taiwan. Trump could win. He's almost certainly going to get the Republican nomination. That gives him about a 50-50 chance of becoming president again. He and his Republican allies, and there are 70 members of the House of Representatives who want to stop aid to Ukraine. You could get a halt of aid to Ukraine. European public opinion could turn against Ukraine aid. Most recently, the Poles, have gotten into a fight with the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians, with all this grain on their hands, they can't ship it through the Black Sea yet. So they're shipping it into the EU. And by shipping it into the EU, that includes Poland, and Polish farmers are finding that they're going bankrupt because the price of grain is so cheap and they can't sell their grain. So this is a domestic political problem in Poland of some seriousness. If we were to lose the war in Ukraine and withdraw weapons from Kiev, you could see, if you were President Xi of China, what your conclusion would be. It might be the same one as Putin's on February 24th, 2022, that we can get away with this. That is the end. Yes.
None of your alternatives suggested what the government has said was their fear in weapons contributions, which is an expansion of the West against East, getting NATO fully involved in a war against Russia. You just don't see that as a realistic alternative.
Well, the reason I don't see it as realistic is that Putin's army has been shown to be a paper tiger, to use the old Maoist term to describe the United States nuclear arsenal. Short of their nuclear weapons, the Russians have really been shown to be bluster. They can't even defeat a country 1/3 the population, less than 1/3 of the size of Russia, and they need military reform in the worst way. So ironically, now that Finland and Sweden have strengthened NATO and strengthened it hugely because they have universal military service. We don't, but the Swedes take defense very seriously, and they have tremendous capabilities. And imagine if the Swedes and the Finns decided that they wanted to conduct military exercises that were semi-threatening along that border. You know, all of a sudden Putin would have to shift whole contingents of the Russian army from Ukraine, which is an interesting thought.
North Korea, playing a role in the.
Yes, North Korea is clearly, Kim, they're all named Kim, but this Kim, and Putin had a summit together just a few days ago.
Right.
The defense ministers met, I think, yesterday, and not much is being revealed, but I think it's pretty clear what the advantages are in a trade between the two. Kim gets Russian rocket technical assistance. Putin gets North Korean drones.
How do you think China's going to react to that?
I don't know. China so far has not delivered a massive amount of military equipment to Russia that it could have. And I think the only reason has to be that the Chinese don't want to be subject to any more American economic pressure than they already have been. Because the Chinese economy is quite intertwined with ours.
They don't even fear, the Chinese don't have fear of North Korea.
I don't think they have fear of North Korea, but I think they find North Korea awkward, a problem, partly because it just complicates Beijing's relationships with Washington. On the other hand, if it causes Washington some consternation, it's free of charge for China. They probably think, well, that's not bad. Jerry?
I'm just thinking of the United States, the will of the American people. When you're asking for $24 billion, time after time after time, where does that come from? I'm concerned that the will of the American people will fail. And they'll just toss up and just say, we can't do it anymore. I would really like to see the NATO countries and other countries of close proximity to Russia come forth with much more aid than what they're given. It seems the whole thing is falling on our country now to keep this country fighting. And I just question how long we can do this.
Well, it's a good question. I think that using round numbers, probably NATO has provided Ukraine with $100 billion worth of equipment. We've probably provided about half of that, maybe a little less. So it's nothing that's going to break our economy. And while I share your concern, my own personal attitude is I'd rather spend tens of billions now than many trillions later. Now, that's a hard case to make because you're spending billions now. And you don't know you'll have to spend the trillions later. But that's my sense. In the case of the parties, of course, the Democrats are foursquare behind Biden. The Republican Party, which used to be internationalist and under the likes of President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles and so on, that party, which was committed to resisting Russian imperialism, now has a potent wing, which is, I would call it isolationist. Some of it, of course, is just taking political shots at Biden, because if Biden's in favor of the war, then of course you want to be against it so you can get the support of all those who are against the war or support for Ukraine's war. Yes, Bill.
Are we in World War III and just don't know
No, I don't think so. I mean, if we were in World War III, we'd know it.
it? Well, remember, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Prussians and the Germans invaded Poland. First thing that happened was nothing happened. There was another 9 months or almost a year before all of a sudden the Belgians figured out what was happening.
The era called the phony war.
Yeah,
Well, never say never, of course. But, and I suppose it fits into this alternative future number 4. I think it's very unlikely. I don't think Putin has the strength to create a World War III. I think we're all surprised, pleasantly surprised by that. The fact is, he can't take Kharkov. He can't take Kiev. He can't take Mykolaiv, which is where they used to build all their submarines in the Soviet days. I mean, Ukraine, not only is usually called the breadbasket of Europe, but much more importantly, Ukraine was the heart of Soviet the military industrial complex of the Soviet Union. And they've lost it, and they can't get it back. And the Donbass was the center of that military industrial complex, which is why it, along with the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, Crimea, are such attractive magnets to Putin. So
It's fascinating. You've mentioned so many alternatives. You've never mentioned anybody or any nation brokering a peace. Why did you leave it out?
well, I left it out because I don't think it's going to happen. The Russian terms are that any peace agreement must transfer sovereignty of those 4 provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, to Russia and become an integral part of the Russian Federation. And in fact, in the case of 2, Luhansk and Donetsk, Putin has annexed them legally. He doesn't control them, he controls only a sliver of them. The Ukrainian position is that we're not going to give up Ukrainian territory to an aggressor. There's not a whole lot to trade on there. Now, as I suggested, one could imagine that if you had enough war weariness set in Moscow, in Kiev, in Washington, Paris, Warsaw, Berlin, if enough war weariness set in, you could get a situation in which pressure is applied to the Ukrainians to give up the Crimea in return for getting back the Donbass. I think that is very hard to imagine. An awful lot of blood has been shed. The Ukrainian nation is more united probably than it has been in its history. Even those parts of Ukraine in the east, where you have so many Russian speakers, so many families that include within the same family Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, those people have turned against Moscow. And so what used to be, and you can see it in the electoral maps of the 1990s and early 2000s, what used to be a clear division between the eastern Ukraine, where the voters would vote for pro-Moscow presidents, and the central and western Ukraine, where nationalism is stronger, would vote for a pro-EU, pro-NATO president. That distinction, I think, if you held free elections today, which you can't, I think that distinction would have largely dissolved. And so, here Putin, everything he has done has been counterproductive. He's got a united Ukraine against him now, whereas before, he had about a third of the population thinking that, maybe we should forego good relations with the EU and membership in the EU. Maybe we ought to tie our trade to Moscow. And I think that element is gone. Bill.
On the Korean Peninsula, there is a truce. There's no peace treaty. The truce has been in place for half a century. Is that a model?
I mean, it could be if you get that war weariness. I think that in that case, of course, you had Chinese troops being a decisive element in North Korea. You had US troops fighting and killing the Chinese as the Chinese were killing Americans. And there was certainly a desire to end the war because of our direct involvement. Right now, we're getting a super deal. If you want to look at it that way, we are getting the degradation of the Russian army for $40–50 billion and not a single American life. That's a hell of a good deal. If I were the Ukrainians, they're very grateful for the military weapons we send them. They want more. But if I were a Ukrainian, I'd have some feeling that, if the Americans are really serious about this, why don't they show up in the Western Ukraine and relieve all of our people there, and in central Ukraine, draw a line of demarcation down and say to Putin, this is a red line, and if you fire any of your missiles into Kiev, say, line would be east of Kiev, if you fire any of your missiles or drones into Kiev, then we will respond against the Russian army. I can understand Ukrainians thinking that that might not be a bad idea. I don't think it's a bad idea. It's
Escalation.
well, it isn't. We place our forces in Ukraine on the invitation of an elected Ukrainian government that is defending itself the way Prague did not defend itself against the Nazis when Hitler took the Sudetenland with the blessings of the prime ministers of Britain and France.
Rochambeau in Washington.
What did he do?
There are more Frenchmen in Yorktown than America.
Oh. Any other questions?
I just got one quick comment.
Sure.
You watch this war in Ukraine, and you see 100 miles in the front, life is normal. People going to and from their work, school, eating outdoors. And then it's just mind-boggling. Down the road a bit, take a left, and all of a sudden, you're into some of the worst warfare since World War I. It just really is startling.
It's surreal. If you want to follow some of this, there's absolutely sensational reporting in the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books by people who are on the front line, in addition to the Institute for the Study of War. Peter, your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's all these polls from Russia that, support Putin. And I mean, is there any war wariness about him and his position he's taken with this war? Or are people in Russia really supportive of him? I mean, are those polls believable?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions. One is that there's no war weariness yet, except among members of the intelligentsia, hundreds of thousands of whom have fled the country and are now living in Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, or Turkey, or Stockholm, which is in a way unfortunate, but who's to say? Can you trust the polls? You cannot, absolutely cannot trust the polls by the state polling organizations. There is one poll, one independent pollster who's been doing this now since late Gorbachev, since about 1986, the Levada polls. And when you see Levada polls, then you can trust them. And they show overwhelming support for Putin. In fact, Putin's popularity soared when he invaded Ukraine. You know, people are patriotic everywhere. And particularly, of course, if they get all of their information from state-controlled television. Thank you for your patience and
Well, thank you, Nick, for a very interesting and illuminating presentation. And the discussion that followed was certainly informative. Thank you.
thank you all for being so attentive.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for zooming in. We hope you'll be with us in October 23rd, for a lecture by Andy Grenell. It is titled Rehabilitating and Sharing the Grenell Cottage, 1987 to 2023, honoring a father's quest to restore one of Shabig's historic homes. So thank you and good night. We hope to see you in October.